Imagine you conquering half the known world, and then telling the people you defeated that their gods, their language, and their traditions would remain untouched. You don't burn cities, carry out mass deportations, or force cultural erasure. In a world where empires ruled through terror, one ruler did something that seemed almost impossible. He conquered vast territories, stretching from Central Asia to the Mediterranean, and instead of forcing everyone to become Persian, he allowed them to remain who they were. Greeks, Babylonians, Egyptians, Jews, Lydians, and dozens of other peoples suddenly found themselves part of the same empire. And yet many of them did not see themselves as conquered. They saw themselves as protected. That ruler was Cyrus the Great. And the empire he built became the largest political structure the world had ever seen up to that moment. An empire that connected 3 continents, created administrative systems that modern governments still resemble today, and gave birth to the civilization that would eventually become Iran. Welcome to Imperium. Here, you'll discover what life was like many years ago. To support us in building this impressive historical journey, subscribe to the channel. It's quick and free. But the most remarkable part of this story is not how Cyrus conquered the world. It is how he chose to govern it. If you traveled across the Iranian plateau around 600 BC, you would not expect to find the birthplace of one of history's greatest empires. The land was difficult. Mountains cut across the terrain in jagged ranges. Deserts stretched across the interior. Water was scarce, and fertile land appeared only in scattered pockets. Instead of large centralized kingdoms, the region was filled with tribes and small states competing for survival. 2 related peoples dominated the area. The Medes, who controlled the northwest and had built a respectable kingdom, and the Persians, who lived further south in a region they called Persis, in what is now the province of Fars in modern Iran. The Persians were proud, fiercely independent, and skilled warriors. But at this time they were subjects of the Medes. They paid tribute. They obeyed Median authority. And for generations they waited. No one in the region believed that the Persians would ever become anything more than a subordinate people living in the shadow of their stronger northern neighbors. But history has a strange habit of hiding enormous change in the most unlikely places. And among the Persians, a young king was about to appear who would change everything. His name was Cyrus. To understand why Cyrus was so unusual, you need to understand how power worked in the ancient world. Empires before Persia were built through fear. The Assyrian Empire had perfected this system centuries earlier. When the Assyrians conquered a city, they did not simply take control. They destroyed it. Entire populations were deported hundreds of miles away from their homes. Rebellious leaders were executed publicly. Cities that resisted were burned to the ground as a warning to everyone else. The goal was simple: make resistance unthinkable. Babylon inherited much of this approach. While Babylon was famous for its culture, astronomy, literature, and monumental architecture, it was also capable of enormous brutality. When Babylon defeated the kingdom of Judah, thousands of people were forced into exile. This event became known in history as the Babylonian captivity. Across the ancient Near East, the rules were clear. If you conquered a people, you broke them. You erased their identity. You humiliated them. That was how empires maintained power. And then Cyrus appeared with a completely different idea. Cyrus became king of the Persians around 559 BC. At the time, he ruled only a relatively small territory within the Median Empire. But he had something that many rulers lacked. He understood people, and he understood that power did not always need to rely on terror. Around 550 BC, Cyrus launched a rebellion against the Median king Astyages. On paper, it looked like a suicidal decision. The Medes were stronger. Their army was larger. Their kingdom had powerful allies. But Cyrus understood something important about Median rule. Astyages had alienated many of his own nobles and generals. And during the campaign against Cyrus, something extraordinary happened. Part of the Median army defected. Generals who were supposed to fight Cyrus instead switched sides. Within a short time, the Median capital Ecbatana fell. But the moment that followed revealed something about Cyrus that shocked the ancient world. He did not destroy the city. He did not execute Astyages. Instead, he treated the defeated king with respect. The Medes were not enslaved. They were integrated into the new Persian state. What Cyrus had just done was almost unheard of. He had defeated a rival empire and then absorbed it instead of crushing it. The next great challenge came from the west. The kingdom of Lydia, located in what is now western Turkey, was ruled by a king named Croesus. Croesus was legendary for his wealth. So wealthy, in fact, that his name became synonymous with immense riches. Lydia had developed one of the earliest systems of coinage in the world, and Croesus controlled vast reserves of gold and silver. Before attacking Persia, Croesus consulted the famous oracle of Delphi in Greece. The oracle told him that if he crossed the Halys River and attacked Persia, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus interpreted this as a promise of victory. He crossed the river, and the prophecy came true. A great empire was destroyed. Just not the one he expected. Cyrus defeated Croesus near the city of Sardis around 547 BC. But once again, the most remarkable moment came after the battle. According to Greek historians, Croesus was captured and prepared for execution. Yet Cyrus changed his mind. Instead of killing him, he spared his life, and Croesus eventually became one of Cyrus's advisors. For the second time, a defeated king had been turned into a collaborator rather than an enemy. This was not weakness. It was strategy. If Lydia was wealthy, Babylon was magnificent. For centuries it had been one of the greatest cities in the world. Its walls were enormous. Greek writers claimed that 2 chariots could ride side by side across their width. Its temples towered above the skyline. Its scholars studied astronomy and mathematics. Its gardens were said to be among the wonders of the ancient world. When Cyrus turned his attention toward Babylon in 539 BC, he was preparing to conquer the most prestigious city in the ancient Near East. But the conquest itself was surprisingly swift. Persian forces entered the city with relatively little resistance. And what happened next astonished everyone. There was no sack of the city. No mass slaughter. No destruction of temples. Instead, Cyrus presented himself as a liberator. He paid respect to Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. He promised that the temples would remain protected. And then he issued one of the most extraordinary proclamations in ancient history. All peoples who had been deported by previous empires were allowed to return to their homelands. Among them were the Jews, who had been living in exile since the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem. Cyrus allowed them to return. He returned sacred objects that had been taken from their temple, and he even supported the reconstruction of that temple. This act was so remarkable that the Hebrew Bible later referred to Cyrus as the Anointed One of God, a foreign king honored in Jewish scripture. In the ruins of Babylon, archaeologists in the 19th century uncovered a small clay cylinder covered in tightly packed lines of cuneiform writing. It is not large, barely 23 centimeters long. At first glance, it looks like many other administrative records produced by ancient scribes. But the text inscribed on this cylinder contains one of the most remarkable political statements of the ancient world. Today it is known as the Cyrus cylinder. The inscription describes how Cyrus entered Babylon, how the city accepted his rule, and how he presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of order, after what he described as the misrule of the previous Babylonian king. The text also describes something even more unusual. Cyrus announces that the temples of the region would be restored. The gods that had been removed from their sanctuaries by earlier rulers would be returned. The peoples who had been deported from their homelands would be allowed to go back. To modern readers, this language sounds surprisingly familiar. It speaks of respect for local traditions, religious freedom, and the right of communities to return to their lands. For that reason, some historians and political thinkers have described the Cyrus Cylinder as the first charter of human rights in history. Others caution that this interpretation may go too far. After all, ancient rulers often used proclamations like this to legitimize their authority. Cyrus was still an emperor. His armies had conquered vast territories. His rule ultimately rested on military power. But even those who reject the modern human rights label admit that Cyrus was doing something politically revolutionary for his time. Instead of forcing uniformity across the empire, he allowed diversity to remain. Different languages continued to be spoken. Different legal systems remained in place. Different religions continued to operate openly. For the peoples living under Persian rule, this created a very different experience from what earlier empires had imposed. A Babylonian could still worship Babylonian gods. A Jew could return to Jerusalem. An Egyptian could continue traditional religious practices along the Nile. And this policy was not simply moral philosophy. It was practical governance. By respecting local traditions, Cyrus transformed conquered populations into participants in the empire rather than permanent enemies. In doing so, he laid the foundation for a political system capable of holding together an enormous territory filled with hundreds of different cultures. The cylinder itself survived buried beneath the ruins of Babylon for more than 2,000 years. Today it rests in the British Museum in London. A small piece of clay that still carries the words of a king who governed the largest empire of his time. By the time Cyrus died around 530 BC, the empire he had built stretched from Central Asia to the Mediterranean. It was the largest empire the world had yet seen. But maintaining such a vast territory required more than military victories. It required organization. Cyrus's successors expanded and refined the system. His son Cambyses II conquered Egypt in 525 BC, becoming pharaoh and bringing the Nile Valley into the Persian sphere. But the ruler who truly transformed the empire into a sophisticated administrative machine was Darius the Barn. Darius divided the empire into provinces called satrapies. Each was governed by a satrap who oversaw taxation, security, and administration. But local laws and traditions were allowed to continue. This balance between central authority and local autonomy was revolutionary. Darius also built a massive network of roads. The most famous was the Royal Road, which connected major cities across the empire. Along this route, relay stations allowed messengers to travel enormous distances with incredible speed. Greek historians later described the Persian courier system with admiration. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness stops these messengers from completing their appointed course. Those words now appear on the building of the United States Postal Service. But they were first written to describe the Persian Empire. The conflict between Persia and the Greek city-states has become one of the most famous chapters of ancient history. But the way it is usually remembered is shaped almost entirely by Greek sources. To the Greeks, these wars were nothing less than a struggle for survival against a vast Eastern empire. To the Persians, they were something very different. At the beginning of the 5th century BC, the Persian Empire already stretched across enormous territories. From the Indus Valley in the east, across Mesopotamia and Anatolia, down into Egypt and the Nile Valley, and north toward the Caucasus. Within this massive imperial system lived tens of millions of people. The Greek world, by comparison, consisted of small independent city-states scattered along the Aegean coast. These cities often fought among themselves. They shared language and culture, but they were politically fragmented. The conflict began when several Greek cities in Asia Minor rebelled against Persian rule in what became known as the Ionian Revolt. Athens supported the rebels. For the Persian king Darius Vuldert, this was not simply a regional disturbance. It was a challenge to imperial authority. Darius responded by launching a campaign across the Aegean. In 490 BC, Persian forces landed on the plain of Marathon, not far from Athens. There, the Athenian army managed to defeat the invading Persian troops in a battle that later became legendary in Greek history. But Marathon did not end Persian ambitions in the region. 10 years later, Darius's son Xerxes assembled an even larger expedition. Ancient writers describe vast armies and enormous fleets crossing from Asia into Europe. While modern historians believe these numbers were exaggerated, the scale of the campaign was still immense. Greek forces resisted fiercely. At Thermopylae, a small Greek force led by Spartan warriors held a narrow mountain pass against the Persian army for several days. Eventually, they were overwhelmed. The Persians advanced south. Athens was evacuated and then burned. But the decisive moment came at sea. At the Battle of Salamis, the Greek fleet managed to trap and defeat a large portion of the Persian navy in the narrow waters between the mainland and the island. Without full naval support, Xerxes withdrew much of his army. Later battles eventually forced the remaining Persian forces to retreat. Greek writers celebrated these victories as a triumph of freedom against tyranny. But from the perspective of the Persian Empire, the situation looked very different. Even after these defeats, Persia remained the most powerful state in the known world. Its territory was vast, its economy strong, its administrative system sophisticated. The wars with Greece were only a small episode on the western edge of an empire that continued to function and prosper for generations. For more than 200 years, the Persian Empire remained one of the dominant powers of the ancient world. Multiple kings ruled from the imperial capitals of Susa, Persepolis, and Babylon. Royal ceremonies celebrated the diversity of the empire, with delegations from dozens of subject nations bringing tribute and gifts to the king. Stone reliefs carved into the walls of Persepolis still show these delegations. Egyptians, Babylonians, Lydians, Indians. Each group dressed in its own traditional clothing, carrying offerings that represented the wealth of their lands. These images reveal something remarkable about Persian imperial ideology. The empire presented itself as a structure that united many cultures under one authority. But no empire lasts forever. In the 4th century BC, a new power rose from the Greek world. A young Macedonian king named Alexander began a campaign that would transform the political landscape of the ancient Near East. Within just a few years, Alexander defeated Persian armies in several decisive battles. One by one, the great cities of the empire fell. In 330 BC, Alexander entered Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persian power. At some point during his occupation of the city, the palace complex was set on fire. Ancient sources disagree on exactly why. Some claim it was an act of revenge for the earlier Persian destruction of Athens. Others suggest that Alexander regretted the decision afterward. But the burning of Persepolis became a powerful symbol, the fall of the empire that Cyrus had built. Yet the story does not end there, because Alexander himself became deeply influenced by the Persian world he had conquered. He adopted elements of Persian court ceremony. He wore Persian clothing. He married a Persian noblewoman. He even encouraged his officers to marry Persian women in an attempt to blend the two civilizations. Many of his Greek followers disliked these policies intensely. But Alexander had seen something that earlier conquerors often missed. The Persian Empire had succeeded not only because of military strength. It had succeeded because it found ways to govern diversity rather than eliminate it. Today, the ruins of Persepolis still stand in southern Iran. Columns rise from the stone platform where the ceremonial palaces once stood. Reliefs carved into the walls show delegations from across the empire bringing tribute to the Persian king. Even after more than 2,000 years, the scale of the site is astonishing. It reminds us that the Persian Empire was not a minor kingdom on the edge of history. It was one of the most ambitious political experiments the ancient world ever attempted. An empire that connected regions stretching from India to the Mediterranean. An empire that built roads across deserts and mountains. An empire that allowed many cultures, languages, and religions to exist under a single political structure. In the British Museum, the Cyrus cylinder still rests quietly in its display case. Visitors walk past it every day. Some barely notice it. But that small clay object preserves a message written more than 25 centuries ago. A message from a king who ruled the largest empire of his time, declaring that power did not need to erase the identities of those it governed. Whether Cyrus always lived up to those ideals remains a question historians continue to debate. But the idea itself was extraordinary. In a world where power was usually expressed through destruction, Cyrus proposed a different vision. That strength could come not from forcing everyone to become the same, but from allowing differences to exist within a shared system. And perhaps that is why the story of the Persian Empire still matters today. Because the challenge that Cyrus faced more than 2,000 years ago is the same challenge humanity continues to struggle with now. How do you build a world where many different peoples can live together without destroying what makes each of them unique? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the weekly videos. Thank you so much.